So in 15th century Europe, Filippo Brunelleschi rediscovered linear perspective, a visual technique to create the illusion of depth in a picture. Now, basically, it consists of three components. Most of you already know this. There's a horizon line, there's receding parallel lines, and then there's a vanishing point. Now, this innovation here, it may seem very simple to us and obvious, but it really set off a wildfire. The difference between Middle Age and Renaissance paintings, as you can see side by side, is striking, because artists in the Renaissance started to prioritize learning the techniques of recreating what the eye could see. So this realness became the key feature of Renaissance art. And linear perspective became an open source technology, spreading like Linux. Now, one of the key evangelists who helped Brunelleschi spread the code for linear perspective was this hype man, Leon Battista Alberti. And he published a book called On Pictures, outlining all of the mathematical geometry formulas for painters to use to recreate linear perspective. So basically, he wrote the jQuery of linear perspective and shared that code with the world. And in his book, he didn't just talk about the mathematical superiority of linear perspective, he also outlined how painting with linear perspective was morally superior to other forms of painting and representation. So Alberti believed that linear perspective was the highest form of art because he believed it captured reality. He says, a painting aims to represent things seen. He believed that becoming a painter was the, quote, finest practical of all things, because the realness of a painting could enable people to see the world as it was. Alberti thought that painters using linear perspective were giving society a shortcut to greater understanding, making us better people. And other painters agreed. Leonardo da Vinci contended that the poet ranks far below the painter in the representation of visible things. So the value of an artist in Renaissance society was based on how much they could represent reality as the eyes perceived. And so several things happened around the Renaissance with optics and math and art that resulted in a couple of key inventions that gave us the tools to represent the world in ways that we have considered to have a higher fidelity. And one of the key themes that's super central, that runs through like all of these tools, is this singularity of perspective and the dependence on this like single point of view originating in the eye and ending at this vanishing point. And this idea was central to the dominant theory of vision in both Euclidean geometry and linear perspective, that these light rays like literally coming out of our eyes and they meet at one point to give us this very super high resolution perspective of the world. Now, we know that's not how our eyes work. We know that. But we still have this myth that we can see reality from a single perspective, and that this single perspective is the objective truth. Now, we've always wanted to use new technology to help us understand the world better. So what Alberti and so many artists thought about linear perspective is something that we often today think about our own new technologies, from photography to film, virtual reality, and especially big data, like a lot. That's where you see a lot of this language. And this is a mistake, the mistake of conflating what we can see with what we understand. Now, this bias is so persistent that it is one of the criticisms against contemporary art, that, it's somehow, really easy to do. But that's just code for this doesn't conform to this whole set of skills and techniques set up 500 years ago called linear perspective. So why do we get so caught up in privileging our own understanding of the world time and time again? I mean, linear perspective created one of history's most fascinating misjudgments of a technology's ability to create understanding between people. So the Jesuits they really love linear perspective. They were like, this is so great that they adopted it as their tool for missionary work. So they're like, we're going to colonize China with Christianity in the 16th century, and we're going to bring our real life linear perspective paintings with us. They literally did this. The Jesuits thought that once the Chinese see these paintings, they'd be so amazed at how real they were that they would want to convert to Christianity right away. And yes, they really thought this. And then they will replace their gods with Christianity's one single God. So they did this. And at the time, Chinese paintings primarily used aerial perspective. And you can see it doesn't have like a single vanishing point. There's like no horizon line. So when the Jesuits, after making their long trip over, the head of the missionary, Matteo Ricci, he saw how, he saw these paintings and he saw how the Chinese represented the world. And this is what he said. He said, "The Chinese do not know how to paint in oils, nor do they shade the things that they paint, with the result that their paintings are dull and totally devoid of life." Yeah, so the Jesuits looked at these paintings, they thought, I don't see any shadows, I don't see a vanishing point, there's no depth, there's no horizon line. This is clearly a sign that the Chinese lack intelligence because they don't know the mathematical code of representing reality like we do. But you know what the Chinese thought? Well, this 19th century quote captures their sentiment perfectly. "He who judges painting according to the concept of resemblance shows the understanding of a child." Boom. So Chinese paintings use aerial perspective because it matched the Chinese worldview, because there was no single correct vantage point. They did not believe that humans were, at the center of the universe. And in particular, they couldn't fathom why the Europeans made these like giant portraits of themselves, of just their head or just like their, the family. And the Chinese, though, they couldn't imagine why the Jesuits would even want that kind of shading in their paintings. Generously, they thought that maybe the shadows were from the dirt that accumulated on the paintings during the trip from Europe to China. So, yeah, like the Jesuits, the Chinese, they couldn't understand the European worldview. So then the Jesuits had an idea. They're like, we have it. We're going to this is the thing that's going to convince and convert the Chinese. They recreated their paintings with aerial perspective. So here are two paintings of the same exact scene of a visitation of St. Elizabeth Geronimo Nadal. And you can see the original one on the left side, the European one, and then the same exact scene, Chinese style, on the right. And it's pretty, you can see like how different they look, even though it's the same exact scene. And you might say, oh, wow, the Jesuits, they finally got it. They're so sensitive. They were trying to see the world from the Chinese perspective. But that's not actually what they were doing. They were mirroring the Chinese. They were painting like them. They were dressing like them. They even learned their language so they could talk like them. But it wasn't for the ultimate purpose of understanding them. They were doing it to convert them over to their perspective. And the Chinese, they saw through that. They were like, we got you. We know what you're doing. They knew that the Jesuits had an agenda. And the mistake that the Jesuits made is a version of the same mistake we've continued to make for centuries. When new technologies represent and mediate the world for us, we get like super caught up in thinking like the representation is the truth. And then once we know this truth, then we can understand the world better. But these shiny new technologies, they oftentimes end up offering us very little in terms of legitimate, genuine access to reality. In fact, these representations just often distort it. So later, Matteo Ricci, you remember the head Jesuit mission leader who called the Chinese paintings dull and devoid of life. So he was like, I have this one last brilliant idea to convert the Chinese. I'm going to give the Chinese a wider perspective. He wanted to show the Chinese the whole world and how the world actually looked so that he could prove European superiority and ostensibly Jesuit superiority. So he created these humongous maps, carved into 6 blocks that filled the room from like floor to ceiling, and it really was the whole world in one room. And I got to see these maps in person at this exhibit in San Francisco, and it's super impressive because like you can see it's all etched into wood, and it's these 6 panels that just surround you. Now, to make these maps, Ricci had to approximate the geographic contours of the Earth. He had to like reduce, the size of coastlines, and he had to reduce entire civilizations to these simple groupings. He referred to Russia as the country of dwarves. The inhabitants, both male and female, are only about like 1 foot high, being constantly devoured by cranes, and they ride on goats, destroying their enemies' eggs. So this is what came to my mind when I read it. Don't know if that's what came to yours. Ricci's map, like any map, is technology. And every map, just like a film or like a data set, it's the result of a series of choices that the creator has to make about how to represent reality. And in order to represent reality, you'd first have to take all these like super messy, convoluted details of the world, and then you have to reduce it to these like simple, more compact chunks that can be computed either with our minds or with, our computers. But by doing so, these actions, by necessity, they distort reality. And it's the creator's perspective that guides the loss of resolution and the types of trade-offs that have to be made in this representation. Now, the mistake that Matteo made wasn't the loss of resolution, because that has to happen, but it was that he reduced the resolution and then called it the truth. He was pretending that his perspective, really knowing nothing about Russia or the rest of the real world, was reality. But this is what he thought about his map. He said, this is a tool for the armchair traveler in the study to travel about as if it were while reclining at ease in his own study. Lo, without leaving home, one can visit all the countries of the world. But Matteo's map, it didn't work. The Chinese kept painting with parallel perspective, and eventually the Jesuits had to pack up, and they gave up on their mission, and they returned to Europe. From their perspective, it wasn't they who failed. It was the Chinese who failed to understand the truth. But we have been making this same mistake for centuries. We often create technologies to help us mediate and understand the world better, and instead, it just makes things less clear. How often do we repeat this mistake? How often do we repeat what the Jesuits did in our own work or in our everyday lives? How do we become so blind that we start thinking that our singular perspective was superior to all others and that it was the truth? So we did that with photography. For example, Jean-Luc Godard, the French New Wave filmmaker, has this very famous quote where he says, "Photography is truth." Now, before Photoshop, photography felt especially real and truthful. But it's also technology that clearly comes with a perspective. The photographer is standing in a single point, choosing what to go in the frame. And even so, we often hold on to this idea that photography is truth. Founded in 1988, National Geographic was the first magazine to print photographic spreads of locations around the world. And in 1896, the magazine made what was seen as this groundbreaking decision at the time to include photographs of topless native women. This is Zulu bride and bridegroom, and the caption read, "These people are of a dark bronze hue and have good athletic figures. They possess some excellent traits but are horribly cruel when once they have smelled blood." And ever since then, National Geographic has shown pictures of native women bare-breasted. And they did this from behind a shield of objectivity. National Geographic portrayed itself as a scientific magazine, bringing the real world to everyday people. But it's not always the truth. because National Geographic would sometimes publish doctored or staged photos to fit their perspective. Like, for example, when one Polynesian girl was deemed too fair-skinned, Melville M. Payne, the editor of the Society, took care of it. He said, "We darkened her down to make her look more native, more valid, you might say." Or when National Geographic in 1984 published this photo of a woman and child traveling by first class in a train in India, and there's a porter balancing the luggage on his head. Now, the photographer claimed that this was a real moment, but in fact it was entirely staged. The suitcase was empty, and the woman was a friend of a photographer. Now, whether it's the darkening of skin or the staging of a photograph, both are examples of National Geographic trying to normalize data to fit their perspective of what the data should look like. So the Polynesian girl, she's too fair-skinned. We'll lighten her. You know, we need to make Indian travel look like really third world and a big burden, so let's just stage it. They reduced resolution of reality to fit their single perspective. And this is really all about deciding what data to choose, you know, how to collect it and how to reduce it. There is nothing objective about it. National Geographic ended up manipulating the data, and they only presented data that fit their worldview. Topless women as exoticized objects and dark-skinned men doing very savage things. So intentionally or unintentionally, their perspective reflected American imperialism and non-white people as the other. National Geographic, they set out to use technology, you know, photography, to understand the world better, and they ended up presenting a very distorted representation of reality without even realizing it. But this isn't history, this is right now. For example, these are just a few photos of women of colors who are, you know, still shown bare-breasted as a sign of their exoticism. And these are photos that I found from the last few decades. Several of them are from the last few years, and 2 of them are from this year. So even though topless women and breastfeeding exist all around the world in different cultures, including the Mediterranean, including right down the road here at Calais, my favorite spa in the world, in Malmö, it wasn't until this past January that they finally posted the first photo of a Western woman without a top on. And she happens to be a Swedish woman swimming in an ice hole, by the way. Say, Sweden's always doing the first things. So, nevertheless, though, what really got me into this National Geographic history was this quote that I had found from Harvey Wiley, who was speaking at a National Geographic banquet in 1912, when he said, "I'm glad that I live in the age when it is not necessary any longer to wander into distant regions to learn geography. All we have to do now is to sit still in easy chairs, and our great men bring the world before us." This is like Matteo Ricci all over again. I mean, this is like a couple hundred of years of difference, but we can trace the same kind of thinking, that we can just sit here and let some technology bring the world in. We can just sit there passively. Now, expecting technology to offer a shortcut to understanding has been very implicit in some of our earliest technologies of representation. It didn't just start with linear perspective. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the evolution of the mirror. And the earliest recorded mirror dates back to 6200 BCE in Turkey. It's made of polished obsidian, this black glass that's created from volcanic eruptions. Now, the Chinese, their earliest mirrors were polished jade and circular to represent the universe. The Greeks used concave mirrors to blind enemy ships with the sun during wars, whereas the Romans, they used convex mirrors during orgies to make their genitals look bigger. Yes, we now know where that obsession comes from. But things really changed in the 16th century when Venetian glassmakers discovered this trick. They're like, we are going to put tin amalgam on the back of a piece of glass. And by doing that, it changed everything. It changed how truth would be defined, because people interpreted this realness of the reflection from a glass mirror as truth. Mirrors were valued because they were good at recreating what the eye could see. This was the West's first truth machine. So glass mirrors became this like super aspirational technology that only the wealthy could afford. They prided themselves on owning something that could reflect truth. You start seeing it pop up in all these Renaissance paintings of the wealthy. Glass mirrors showed up in Shakespeare's plays as this object of truth. And so all of this, it changed the way people define the truth as a singular, stable, objective thing. And in the West, it sparked this this impulse to make this like noble, important quest for reflecting something out of a singular reality. This is when we started to conflate what we can see with what is the truth. The way we're acting now and all the things we're doing in technology, it started a long time ago, many, many centuries ago. And people put so much trust in the technology of mirrors that they used them to justify the killing of women for being witches. They believed that you can identify a witch in a mirror because her reflection would reveal the devil, and specifically, you then could see the devil's butthole in the mirror. Is this true? And just in case you can't see from far, here's the devil, and this is the butthole, and then pew, going over to the mirror. Now, within this 200-year period, between 40 to 40,000 women mostly were killed because of how 40,000 to 100,000 women were killed because of the technology. So we've been set up to think that mirrors are a reality when in fact they're wrong. They're 180 degrees off. And we know this. There's a reason why it's legally required for side view mirrors in US and Canada and India to be labeled with the warning that objects are closer than they appear. Because when you have to make this like life or death decision, like changing lanes while driving, you have to be reminded that whatever you're seeing in that convex mirror needs to be corrected with some kind of computing power so that you don't die. So now we've adapted our understanding to know that mirrors aren't the truth. There are these contests. This is an amazing YouTube rabbit hole that you can go down. But there's these contests for people to show how much mirrors can distort our understanding of reality and how much it can manipulate our perspective of what we can see. But we've learned to work with mirrors and not get blinded by them. But when it comes to shiny new technology, right now, people are becoming very hypnotized by virtual reality. They're saying that since you can see more in virtual reality, you can understand more. And in particular, that virtual reality can lead us to being more empathetic, that it's going to lead us to more empathy. We heard this as early as 1998 from Jared Lanier, who coined the term virtual reality. He said, virtual reality is the ultimate lack of class or race distinctions or any other form of pretense, since all form is variable. I think that will be an extraordinary tool for increasing communication and empathy. And this idea about VR as empathy really took off last year again when acclaimed filmmaker Chris Milk gave a TED Talk about VR and is titled How Virtual Reality Can Create the Ultimate Empathy Machine. Specifically, he said, so it's a machine, but through this machine, we become more compassionate, we become more empathetic, and we become more connected, and ultimately, we become more human. Now, Nani de la Peña, journalist and commonly referred to as a godmother of virtual reality, says that her work in bringing journalism to virtual reality creates this thing called an empathy generator. Now, this hype, it's not just about the technology or the application or new markets even, but it's about this leap forward in human development. It's now supposed to make us better human beings. Saying that VR makes us better human beings or it's going to lead us to more empathy, it's kind of like Euclid explaining vision as the result of these like light rays emitting from our eyes. People who claim that VR causes empathy assume that this realness of the like 360 immersion is so powerful that it can just overcome distance and it's going to teleport you to this any experience as if you were there. And once you're there in that experience, you're going to understand the perspective of that subject. Now, this argument, it makes it seem like no one is constructing the perspective, as if VR is beyond a single perspective. But it's not. Take the acclaimed VR film Clouds Over Sidra, made by Gabo Aurora and Chris Milk. And by the way, Gabo Aurora is here at the conference and will be speaking tomorrow, so super exciting. This amazing film depicts the Syrian refugee crisis through the eyes of a 12-year-old girl, Sidra. And in this scene, we have this God's eye view of Sidra's school and her home. And then we switch in a few seconds to an eye level view looking at Sidra herself in her bedroom. Now, viewers will eventually have more control over what to view in volumetric VR. But even then, a filmmaker still has to decide what is even worthy of being filmed. Everything we see in virtual reality still comes down to a decision of perspective. This is a beautiful piece, but Al Jazeera thinks that by watching this film alone, you can visit the camp without even leaving the US. So here we go again, echoing the words of Matteo and now National Geographic. So here's the thing. I do think VR can widen our perspective. I really do. I think it can widen our world. It can widen our understanding of what's out there. But their success, the success of films that are able to do that, it's not because there's something more real or more truthful or more empathetic about the medium. It's because these great filmmakers like Gabo, they're out there doing the hard work of creating the context for their work. They're looking at people in the eyes afterwards saying, this is important, and let me explain this context to you. So here's a really great comparison of two VR films to show you what I mean. You can look this up when you go back home, but one is called 6x9 on the left, and the other is called Confinement. Now, both tackle the subject of solitary confinement in the US prison system. Solitary confinement is, the act of to lock someone up alone by themselves for anywhere from weeks to years and to decades. We have hundreds, we have I think tens of thousands of people in the US in solitary confinement right now. And some have been in there for more than 20 years by themselves. It is one of the most extreme, inhumane forms of punishment. And both 6x9 and Confinement, they're using VR to argue for the urgency that we must end this practice right now. And they're doing this by putting viewers inside the experience of solitary confinement. Now, while both have received tons of media attention, 6x9 on the left here does a much better job of creating a compelling experience. I mean, you can already see from just this trailer of a flat side by side, as Confinement is just a view of a box the entire time, whereas 6x9, there's like words coming in to the screen, and the sound architecture, as you can see, there's a totally different experience. And this is because Francesca Panetta, the producer, she engaged, the producer of 6x9, she engaged real survivors of solitary confinement and counselors and psychologists and lawyers. She was trying to gain more perspectives as she was making the film. She didn't just rely on technology to create empathy. And in fact, Francesca said, I don't think the format of VR is necessarily more empathetic. So I really wanted to understand, what did she do to make such a compelling VR film? So I talked to Johnny Perez here, who is a survivor of 3 years of solitary confinement. He's spent across 8 different prisons over his 13-year sentence. And he's also one of 6 advisors who were formerly incarcerated and working closely with Francesca on the film. And Johnny explained to me that Francesca always found ways to check in with the team to check her assumptions and her biases. And she incorporated their perspectives and experiences into the film. So for example, when you're watching 6x9, you'll see like all these words pop up on the screen, onto the walls. And these are all words that come from the interviews with Johnny and the other advisors. And he consulted her on the actual layout of the room first by drawing it on napkin down to the details of what was even allowed in the room. And then Francesca and her creative team, they recreated a representation of the cell based on his drawing. And he even advised them on how to build the sound architecture, such as when you hear it, you'll hear the sound dripping of the pipes and how the sound changes as you move to different parts of the cell. Now, I can't speak for how the other VR producer created Confinement, but when I asked Johnny to watch Confinement, he said, I can tell you now, it wasn't made by someone who worked meaningfully with people who were directly affected by solitary. And I asked him to explain a bit more, and he listed a bunch of things that he found inaccurate about Confinement's portrayal of solitary. He said, look, Real solitary, they're not going to have pipes on the ceilings because they need to prevent suicide because people are trying to kill themselves all the time. And he said, actually, in real solitary, it's not this sparse. He's like, this one, it actually kind of looks glorified. He's like, in solitary, you have an actual bed with a sheet and a pillow, and you actually have to legally have access to some writing material and a book. And in confinement, there's none of that. Johnny Perez is now a safe reentry advocate at the Urban Justice Center in New York City. He uses 6x9 in his work on the road, at screenings, in presentations to colleges, and in meetings with policymakers and legislators. But he told me, he was like, I can never use confinement because of how inaccurate it is. He's like, I want more VR pieces to be made about solitary, but I can't use this. And this was very important for him because VR is a tool to achieve a greater outcome of changing the criminal justice system. He said, VR by itself is not enough. There has to be a human component before or after the experience to drive the point home. So when Johnny watched Confinement, he was like, look, this clashes with my experience. And this reveals the limited perspective of its creator. I call this perspective collision. It's when the outputs of technology or the things we make, they end up revealing the limited perspective of their creators. It's like the Jesuits, recreating Chinese paintings using linear perspective, or National Geographic only publishing photos of non-Western women topless. These are all instances of perspective collision. But there's another way. To avoid perspective collisions, we need to perspective shift. This is the ability to see the world from another person's point of view. Essentially, it's empathy. And that's what Francesca did with 6x9. And as with making any representation, she reduced reality to this lower resolution, but she did it in a way that wasn't just from her own perspective. She incorporated multiple perspectives, plural perspectives, by collaborating with people who had this higher resolution experiences. And in the end, it made her piece even stronger artistically and educationally. What this comparison shows between 6x9 and Confinement, these two VR films, is that there's nothing inherent in the technology that makes, representing reality any easier in VR. Regardless of the medium, you still have to tell a great story. You still have to learn how to take advantage of the medium's affordances. So the potential of leveraging technology to tell a great story and to create understanding, it's all there. The problem is how it's applied. Because throughout history, it's often been applied through this single perspective. So why do we get so caught up in privileging our own perspective time and time again? It's like we're chickens being hypnotized by a chalk of line. I just found out that chickens can be hypnotized this way. If you just draw a straight line, they really get obsessed over this one thing until someone pulls them away. I mean, this is also another YouTube, rabbit hole. So this is what it seems like when we often get seduced by this new technology. So why do we keep thinking a tool by itself can give us better understanding? Understanding the world is not about replicating one perspective. It's about representing multiple perspectives. This is the work that humans have to do in perspective shifting. And we have been giving the machines the wrong job. We've been outsourcing empathy. And that's partially, I think, because we kind of misunderstand what empathy is really about or what it really involves. When people say, VR is going to produce empathy, or an app, a tech will produce empathy, their definition of empathy is based on this old scientific translation of the German word Einfühlung, which means the ability to imitate internally what you see externally. So this imitation version of empathy is all about mimicking. And when you mimic something or someone, you don't actually have to understand it to be good at it. You just have to copy it. You just do it. So like the Jesuit priest copying the Chinese aerial perspective without really understanding their worldview. And with VR tech, this hypothesis is that if you see something clearly enough in 360, like if you see someone suffering, your emotional state will mimic that suffering state also, which when you think about it, it's pretty crazy. This is very different from the social science definition of empathy, which is not, it's not about the ability to reflect what we see, but it's about the ability to understand how other people see the world from their own perspective. This may not seem like it's a big difference, but it's like as if it's super nuanced, but it is very different, and it's a very big deal, because this is the work of perspective shifting. If we use this version of the definition, then we know that trying to create a machine to shortcut us to empathy is inherently unempathetic. And more than anything, we're seeing perspective collisions manifested in software because software is eating the world. A few years ago, Google released a new machine learning algorithm that automatically tagged photos to describe the content. And yes, the algorithm took all the data it already had and from users tagging their own photos and then learned how to apply it itself. Yes, you can already see what's wrong with it. And right away, Jackie Alcine discovered that Google had tagged a photo of him and his friends gorillas. Now, you could describe this as a failure of algorithms, which is what Google did, but it's not. It's a result of failing to see outside of our own perspective. The algorithm wasn't a computer error. The algorithm was likely trained with more photos of gorillas than it was with photos of people of color. The algorithm's human designers weren't just thinking about all of the different human faces in the world. So these kind of technology mishaps, they happen a lot. Back in 2009, there was HP's Media Smart webcam that couldn't even recognize a darker face that would come in and out of the screen, but it recognized lighter faces. Nikon's camera smart blinking eye algorithm that automatically tagged all Asian faces as blinking. Apple's iWatch heart rate sensors didn't work for people with tattoos. And then there's perspective collisions that happen in organizations all day, and we usually don't hear about it. But there was senior executive at Twitter who thought a great way to increase diversity within our engineering team would be that we can build software to analyze all potential candidates' ethnicities based on their last names. And without realizing that because of the history of slavery in America, Black Americans were forced to take on their masters' last names, making it impossible to track them. All of these perspective collisions are ones that we've been able to identify and, in some cases, correct. The frightening part is when the errors are not obvious. It's when they're so pervasive and they're so complex that we don't even have names for them. These errors affect everything from predictive policing to, mortgage approvals to terrorist watch lists and unintended victims of drone attacks. No one, I think, is making these errors intentionally. I think companies like Google and Facebook and Twitter, they genuinely think that they're making the world better, more easy to interact with. But when we do this from a single perspective, we reenact what Andres Glusman calls the Malkovich bias, which is the notion that everyone uses technology the same way you do. So for the first 100 years of mass production, we pretty much got away with a lot of potential perspective collisions because designers could safely operate under this Malkovich bias, assuming that more or less we were designing for everyone who looked and thought and acted like us. And if we don't, there was no social media feedback loop to make anyone consider other perspectives. So much of our post-industrial world is shaped by this avoidance of thinking about other perspectives. It's why average room temperatures are calibrated at 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius, which is set for men's bodies, not women's bodies, to run cooler. It's why gendered bathrooms don't even have a baby changing room, or if they do, they're only in the women's room. Or it's why seatbelts in cars manufactured before 2011 are less safe for women because automakers weren't required to test with female crash test dummies. Or it's why drug trials are often only tested on white people or medical professionals. Or why website and digital interfaces don't consider color impairment that disproportionately affect males. Now, these are issues of design, but more specifically, these are issues of perspective. And we're going to start seeing a lot more perspective collisions because we're in a more connected digital world. And through that, we're getting more feedback because in a globally connected network, that means Everybody gets to speak. Everybody. And they're saying that software you created, that product you designed, that monetary policy or that political system or the economic arrangement or that policing practice or that military strategy, well, it doesn't work for me. And they're saying that via social media and investigative journalism and the ballot box and through protests on the street. And this is freaking designers, policymakers, coders, and people of privilege the fuck out because it feels like an attack. All of this unnormalized feedback, it's really hard to make a sense of with our minds or our computers. And that's why a lot of this feedback is showing up as perspective collision. It all really comes down to people saying, hey, you did not consider my perspective when you built that thing. Now, it's been the dream all along to live in this globally connected network where we can understand anything and everyone by Googling or reflecting or VRing. But only half the dream has come true, the technical part. It's the social part that we are having a hard time with. For all of our technological tools, we just haven't been as good as taking a multiplicity of perspectives and reflecting that back in our work. This isn't a hardware problem. This is a socialware problem. Now, one reaction among people is to really just to fold inwards and to try in vain to return back to the way things used to be. But the thing is that once people raise their voices, they don't stop. They want to see their perspectives represented and reflected in the world and in the systems around them. They want to be treated equally. They want to live their lives alongside everyone else's. And if the existing institutions won't accommodate their perspective, they're going to let you know. So if we're building technology that we want the world to use, the central question for any organization be, how do we react to this moment of perspective collision and get to perspective shifting so that our stories and our data models reflect a multiplicity of perspectives? How do we make sense of this feedback and turn it into iteration? Now, the last time our society went through this kind of crisis of perspective collision was around 100 years ago during the explosion of mass production. This was a time when new technologies were changing the world. There was massive political change with World War I. Entire empires were falling, countries closed their borders, new nations emerged, and new alliances were being formed. And amidst all of this, there were tons of clashes. The world felt like it was falling apart then. You had women demanding for the right to vote all over the world. You had unions protesting factories. You had colonial outposts demanding for independence. To a privileged person, all of this felt like upheaval. It felt like an attack, similar to how many people feel right now. But this was also a time when you had this explosion in the arts, creating alternative ways of seeing the world. With the visual arts alone, painters like Frida Kahlo, Pablo Picasso, and M.C. Escher, and Rene Magritte, they generated vastly different perspectives on reality. They opened our eyes to the fantastical, to the horrors of what we're blind to, or to the magic of our perceptual abilities. By introducing new perspectives, they influenced culture. They undid centuries the dominance of linear perspective. They created a multiplicity of perspectives. So perhaps we are at that moment right now. We have an incredibly rich world of filmmakers, of musicians, of artists. We have rappers, we have writers, and all these other people who are thinking and allowing us to see multiple perspectives, to perspective shift. But it cannot just live in the world of the arts. It also has to live in the world of tech, of consumer packaged goods, of Fortune 500 companies, of B2B companies. Everyone needs to learn how to perspective shift. This involves skills like listening to understand instead of just listening to reply. The unknown instead of just asking questions about what we already know, to see greater context beyond the technology instead of just focusing on the interaction, to identify things are very difficult to measure, not just making decisions based off of data sets that we already have. And it's also about asking who else do we need to invite to the table instead of just working with the default majority. When people use these skills, they make it possible to listen to a multiplicity of perspectives, and they can come back to the organization and represent those perspectives. Representing information inevitably does involve some loss of resolution, but it doesn't have to come at the expense of a loss of understanding. And that's why iteration is so important, because the conditions are constantly changing. These are the skills that I not only see in some of my fellow ethnographers, but also coders, designers, researchers, some engineers, and connectors of all sorts. Whoever it is, every organization needs to build a mindset and practice of perspective shifting into their base operating system. And some of you may already do this, and I would say, yes, you do. We do empathy every day. We perspective shift every day. We do it with our friends, our family, and people we work with. But it's so much easier to do it with people who you've already chosen as people who share similar values as you. It is so much harder to perspective shift with people who we're less familiar with, for whatever reason, physically, culturally, or linguistically. But we're starting to hear from people that require us to perspective shift if we are going to live together. And that's why a skill set has to be developed. And this is a culture to grow. Because none of this comes naturally. It's something that has to be learned. And that's why I see the conference as an ideal place to begin this practice. We have in this one room people who live at the intersection of arts, of technology, and organizational design from across 26 countries. So these are the days to ask ourselves, how do I understand the talks and conferences? Not just from my own perspective, but from someone else's? How do I bring back multiple perspectives to feed into my work? When I go back to my community, how do I start a practice of exposing myself to other communities' perspectives? And if we do that, if we can use our socialware to impact our hardware and treat perspective collisions as opportunities to create perspective enlightenments, then maybe one day, then we will find ourselves in possession of greater understanding. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much. Hang on, let's do some questions.
What?
Yeah?
Okay, go.
Hang on for your Q&A. Come on.
What?
Thank you so much. Tricia, that was amazing. Thank you so much. As you can hear.
Thank you.
Tricia Wang. I would like us to do something now. I think everybody has something on their mind and we can't take questions from everybody. So how about we just take like 30 seconds to just turn to somebody or in small groups and just tell people what you're thinking right now. It doesn't have to make any sense, but whatever questions you have, like go. And then we'll do some questions for you as well.
I didn't know there was a Q&A.
All right. Thank you. Finish your sentence, please. Now, Tricia is very accessible here, and we'll be able to have conversations in the halls as well. I'm going to ask you one question, though. I've always been taught, I think we've all always been taught, that seeking the truth is a worthy goal. Like, should we stop? Like, I found myself getting a little bit provoked. Like, I want to seek the truth. It seems like a meaningful task.
No, I think it's a terrible goal. Clearly, I think it's terrible because I think it's easy to say that it's fine to say that there's a truth when there's a majority. And so I think for most of our history, we've been in this, post-Pangea world of breaking up into but more or less, it's like we've been comfortable in majorities, and when you're in a majority, you can say there is the truth because someone says the truth. I say it's the truth, so that's why it is. But that's not worthy because it limits you from all these other potential perspectives. Truth is constructed. And so I think that blinds us, and that's why I have a really big issue, with marketing, design, research firms that say, like, we have to find the truth, the consumer truth, and then we're going to sell a product, and then we're going to give it to them. And I think that's terrible. It's like, what happened to searching for, it's perspective? Like, let's just get rid of that line. And as if, like, and this is in data science. In data science circles, I'm working alongside the data science, they'll be like, we have to find, there's a term called a single source of truth, as if that variable is in the data set and it's going to tell us what to do. And so this is a terrible thing that's like permeated our human condition, and we need to get rid of it. So.
That's a fantastic answer. Wonderful. I should also ask you, I think that there are some people here who love VR, which I also do, and I totally hear your criticism of that rhetoric and of the limits of the form. But I think there is maybe a special case, and I wonder if often they're talking about the idea that what you can do in VR, it isn't always done, that's not at all how all the films or games or experiences work, but sometimes you're placed in the subjective position of a person in a specific context. So the idea is that I am seeing literally, I'm in somebody's shoes, I'm seeing through somebody's eyes. And does that not have some, as a storytelling tool, certainly that's powerful. Does that not have some empathy potential right there?
I think it has the potential to create a super powerful experience. Like 6x9, that's exactly what it did. It took advantage of you as the viewer in that location who's in the cell. It starts out with saying, now that you're here, what are you going to do? But that is very hard. As a filmmaker, you still have to learn how to take advantage of that storyline. And it's not like other art forms couldn't do that. So I do agree that it's super powerful, but you just have to, as a filmmaker, learn that you can't be lazy and assume that because it's 360, you're automatically in that view, which is what I see. And we're in the early days of VR. And I think I was just talking with Latoya Peterson, who's here at the conference and speaking this afternoon in the migration section. And she was telling me about how, like, she thinks that, VR in gaming has gone way beyond this, because when you're making these games, you really have to put the player in that position. And they've done a lot more in taking advantage of the medium's affordances.
Yeah, that's fantastic. This conversation will continue. Dear friends, Tricia Wang.
Thank you.